and they made a movie out of it, and it's coming out on Valentine's Day. And I thought, boy, this is where our culture has come in terms of defining love. This is love on Valentine's Day, and it's coming out, and the trailers are out, and lots of people are going to flock out to see it. So what I want to do is take a little look and say, what is the biblical definition of love, of close relationships, and of intimacy? And I think we'll find it's a little bit different than all of that. I'm in a position also where I hear a lot about the state of marriages, and I hear a lot about lots of struggles that happen in relationships. If the devil wants to find a place to break us down, it's going to happen in our households, and it's going to happen in our marriages. And so many marriages, it's so hard to stay centered on Jesus and to stay centered on following him. And so that's where this series comes from. Jesus has made a decision in the scripture that we just heard. The scripture we heard was, Jesus says, all right, here we go. And he stands there waiting, knowing that he's about to be arrested. And he has, before this, spent a lot of time in a garden. And he spent a lot of time saying, God, I know what's about to happen to me. I know this thing about the cup of God's wrath that's about to come to me. And he is so agitated about it that in one of the Gospels, it says he's actually sweating blood. This isn't this kind of Jesus that floats around on high like an angel and everything is great and lovely. He is so, it's such a powerfully scary thing that's about to happen to him that he's sweating blood. And he's down on his knees, and he isn't saying, oh, well, this is going to be great. He's bringing it before God, and he's saying, if there is any way that salvation can happen for mankind, if there is any other program that you can do, please let that happen. Because I think he's aware that he's told the disciples, they're going to do horrible things to me. They're going to beat me and flog me and whip me, and I'm going to be hung on a cross, and I'm going to spend time in hell, being punished for the sins of all of us. And he asks God, if there's any way around that, please let it happen. And then he says, but not what I decide, but what you decide. Whatever you decide, I'm going to go for. He sees that his disciples are sleeping this whole time. He's saying, please, friends, be with me in this. And I think that's part of what convinces him, all right, well, the alternative program is not going to work, because look at how unfaithful these people are, even in my time of greatest need. I think he comes to a place of saying, your will be done. He's made this decision. And then Judas the betrayer and all these people who are coming to arrest him, to crucify him, come up to him. And he has the opportunity there, it says in Scripture, to call on 12 legions of angels. We know from Scripture that angels are powerful. And a legion is anywhere between 5,000 and 6,000 angels. So what he's saying is he could call up to approximately 72,000 angels to come and to fight on his behalf and to defend him. He's made the decision that he's going to lay down his life for us. This is the greatest act of love that has ever occurred in all of human history. For each person in the room and for each person on this planet, I'm laying my life down. I'm giving myself. I'm willing to go be tortured on your behalf. He's made the decision to love, and he's attacked. And then what happens? What does he choose? He has all of the power in the world. He can call on his Father and say, defend me. And his Father would send the angels to defend him. But he doesn't. This is the greatest act of love. And watch his choice. The choice is either defend or to be vulnerable. I'm going to reread what Alice read because I think it's a helpful introduction. We know that if we want to get close to someone, we have to trust, right? We also know that when we're vulnerable, we often get hurt, and here's where we're stuck. We have to trust, but when we do act vulnerably, we get hurt. So knowing that, how do we ever experience intimacy with someone? We're starting the series with this word, vulnerability. Because it's not possible to have close relationships without vulnerability. I can't remember where I stumbled across this, but there's this really interesting phrase that I found called the hedgehog's dilemma. And the dilemma of the hedgehog, we can bring that up, is this. In order to get close, you can't be defensive. But a hedgehog by nature is defensive. Right? They've got all these spines all over the place. And I think that's kind of how it is between all of us too. We feel this dilemma because in order to protect ourselves, we want to put up the guards. But in order to get close to someone, the guards need to be down. And the only way that we can get close to someone is by being vulnerable. But when we're vulnerable, very likely we're going to get hurt in some way. And we're kind of stuck. So this large crowd comes to Jesus. There's all these words in the scripture that are this versus this versus this. And it's attack and defensiveness versus vulnerability. And you'll see it as we go through. There's large crowd, this overwhelming force. There's swords, there's clubs. And then there's Jesus, who's made this decision. There's this kiss, but it's not a kiss. It's not a kiss of, hello, Rabbi, I'm so glad to see you, or I love you so much. And many of us have experienced this at one point or another. Oh, this relationship is so wonderful. I feel so close to this person. And then I come to find out, wow, this isn't really that great at all. This person has really betrayed me. I remember with a friend one time in college when I was having a really hard time. I remember sitting with him, and he was kind of quietly playing his guitar, and I was just sharing stuff that was really hard. Being kicked out of my house, and breaking up with my girlfriend, and really struggling, and kind of pouring it out, and being really vulnerable with him. And after a while, as we were talking, I realized he was focusing much more on the guitar than he was on me. And then after a while, it was kind of like, oh, I'm going to go see if I can get something to eat. I just poured it out there before him. This trust, this intimacy. And how often does that happen in romantic relationships too? We make ourselves vulnerable. We extend this kiss. But in this case, it's a kiss that's not a kiss. The kiss is an indication, okay, this is the guy to come and arrest. And what an ironic way to do it, and what a betrayal. And how many of us have experienced that when we bring forth vulnerability in a relationship? And how many of us have been burned so many times in that we've made the decision, I'm done. I remember consciously making a decision after that where I said, you know what? I'm happy to love people and to care for them and to listen to them, but I'm done putting myself out there and asking people to hear me and to listen to me. People just can't do it. So I'm just going to be a guy to focus on other people and care for them and whatever else. But there's no way I'm putting myself out because I keep on getting burned. People just don't get it. They don't understand. It was a conscious decision that many years later I had to say, wow, the only problem with that is that our God is a vulnerable God, and the only way to get close to people is by putting ourselves out there. So there's a crowd versus Jesus. There's a kiss versus friend. Jesus refers to him as friend. He comes up, Rabbi, greetings, and kisses him. And Jesus says, friend, do what you came to do. Imagine, here's this crowd. They've got clubs and swords. He never stops loving. When we did this in our Bible study, we had to ask the question, do you think he's being sarcastic here when he calls him friend? And I think 90% of us, if we were to say, oh, hey, friend, much more likely that we would be sarcastic than welcome, friend. So there's this attack, and then there's this vulnerability. There's a kiss that's not a kiss, and then there's this friend. He calls us friend even when we stab him in the back. He never stops looking at us that way. And that's so hard for us to get through our heads because who among us is like that? Who among us look at others and say, no matter what you do, I will see you as a friend? But he stays in that. There's coming to a rest on the side of attack, and there's do what you came to do, which is really him saying, Father, your will be done. There's Peter trying to be helpful. Now, John is really nice. John actually doesn't say that it's Peter. We find that out from another gospel, one of the other disciples that rats him out. But John's kind of nice, and he just says, one of the disciples pulled out a sword. But here's Peter's response, right? When you're attacked, you defend. You pull out the sword, and he swiped at the guy. Somehow, apparently Peter hadn't been practicing very much over the last 3 years because he kind of missed doing anything except for cutting the guy's ear off. There's attack. And then on the other side, again, is Jesus' response, which is put your sword away. Like if you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. That's just how it works. There's attack and defensiveness, and there's vulnerability. If I wanted to, I could call 72,000 angels right now. That's the side of attack and vulnerability. This is the human side. This is the justice side. On the other side of it, he says, but the scriptures say that it has to happen this way. I have to sacrifice for you. So I'm choosing again to stay on the side of friend, not on the side of attack. The Jesus way is vulnerable. Jesus love and God love, the thing that establishes real relationships, and the only thing that establishes real intimate relationship is vulnerable love. That's what God love looks like. And it's only possible if you know that you have a big God who's behind you, and if you know that you have a sacrificial God who does the same thing for you. Look at with all of your sin, and you can see God all through history. I'm with you. I'm behind you. I'm your friend. He's done that for each one of us. This love. He doesn't approach us like this, and we're so used to this in this world. And he doesn't approach it like, well, maybe that was a kiss, but it really wasn't. He doesn't approach us like friend, but it's kind of a sarcastic friend. He's continually approaching us. And who hasn't experienced this in their life in some way? This sacrificial, loving, open, I pour out my blood for you. Whatever it is that you've involved yourself in, however shameful. We see this same kind of confidence in the Old Testament in David when he goes to fight Goliath. He comes on the scene and he just says, yeah, I don't get why you guys are like shivering in your boots against this guy. Like obviously this guy is attacking the nation of God. He's mocking God's people. And of course God isn't happy with that. And of course God is going to take this guy out. So David goes to fight him and they put all this armor on him. Defensiveness and ability to go and attack. And he tries it on and says, like the defensive thing doesn't work and it's also not necessary. He takes off the armor and with a little stone takes down the giant. Because of his confidence in God, he doesn't have to be defensive. And the same with us. How many relationships in our lives are threatening in some way? Whether in some ways in our marriage relationship, like I cannot, this is one place where I have to hold up my guard because I just don't trust that you're not going to mock me or henpeck me or that you're not going to make fun of me or order me around. Or work relationships. How many people that we work with are just like, that person just constantly is putting me down or talking down to me or making me feel stupid or whatever else. There's so many Goliaths and there's so many crowds coming with swords, and it's only in our trust of Jesus and our trust of God, this vulnerable God, that we can go out in a vulnerable way. God love and Jesus love is vulnerable. The only reason that we could have any relationship with God is because God has chosen to enter into our world and to be in relationship even though we treat him horribly. Are there any of us that can say, in my relationship with Jesus, I always honor him, I'm always obedient, and still he continues always to speak to us as friend? He's come near to us, and it's the only way. And this is really about surrender. This is Jesus in the garden saying, I surrender, God, to you. I'm willing to give up my will. I'm willing to give up what I hold on to. And I'm willing to give up the defenses that I hang on to. I'm able to be vulnerable and open and accepting because of you. This is not, by the way, just as an aside here, this is not a call to being a punching bag. It's not a call to, well, here's an abusive person in my life, and I guess I just need to sit back and let that happen. That's not the call. It's a call to love people by being vulnerable. And it's a call to allow other people to love by being vulnerable. If there's an abusive person in our life, then we're not loving them by letting them be abusive. And we're not loving them by being someone in their life that just allows that and it's just fine. So this isn't a call to get beat up, but it is a call to lay down our lives for the sake of love. Jesus' example here is I could defend myself, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to be a defensive person for the sake of love, and that's the peace that we need to hang on to in that. Here's the deal. I'm really glad for the church that hired me, and my plan, I don't know what God's plan is, but my expectation is to be here for a long time. We're hoping to raise our kids in Weatherly and see them all graduate in this place. I always say that's my expectation because we've also told God, hey, if you tell us to go to Zimbabwe tomorrow, then we'll go, right? And I hope that's true of each one of us. But I'm really glad for the place that I got hired. I'm really glad, I have to say, for some of the places that I didn't get hired. One of the job interviews that we did, and I've shared about this in times past, but it's such like the perfect example that it comes up now and again. We went to a church, and it was nothing about me, and it was nothing about my relationship with Jesus, and it was nothing about my relationship with other people. It was all about, what do you believe about this? Well, what do you believe about this? And what about this? And well, if you believe that, then why did you go to this conference? Just grilling us. They'd had some bad experiences with a few, like a youth pastor or somebody who they didn't realize some of his credentials or lack thereof, and they were going to make sure that that never happened again. And so their job was to be the police and to make sure they get someone who follows the right doctrine and does the right things and teaches in the right way. They're the police officers. And at one point in the interview process, because Susan flew out to this church with me also, she was crying. And I thought, I think there's something wrong with this picture. When my wife, like before the final interview, was kind of walking around the church crying. This doesn't seem very God. This doesn't seem very Jesus. It doesn't seem very lay down your life out of love. It seems very, very self-protective. And at the last kind of final time together with the board and some other people, I just kind of said, if God calls me to come to this church, I will, but I have to tell you, we have not felt very welcome here. And I remember one of the board members kind of far down the table from me kind of leaned forward, and I don't remember exactly where we were at in the conversation, but I do remember she leaned forward and said, well, I believe that trust has to be earned. And wow, what if that was how Jesus related to us? I mean, what if he looks at the disciples in the garden and says, I'd be willing to lay down my life for you guys if you had done something to earn it. But look at you, you're sleeping. Or, here comes Judas. He's obviously betraying me. How can I trust this guy? Judas approaches and I say, what are you here for, you jerk? You haven't earned my trust. I'm God. It's just not true that trust has to be earned. If we're holding back on loving people and we're holding back on being vulnerable like Jesus is, because we're saying, I'll trust that person, I'll be vulnerable with that person when that person proves that they're trustable, when that person proves that they're going to love me well enough, it'll never happen because we are messed up people. It's just not true that trust has to be earned. What's true about trust is that trust is extended. What's true about vulnerability and love is that vulnerability and love are extended. It's given. It's given to someone who doesn't deserve it. It's given to someone who comes to betray us. It's given to someone who has hurt us in the past. It is true. If I am vulnerable, I will get hurt. Like Jesus wasn't gambling here, like, well, hopefully, I'll be vulnerable and hopefully it'll work out okay. It wasn't a gamble. He knew what he was choosing into. And we have to do the same thing. If we're going to grow any closer to each other, there's no other option. There's no second plan. It's not possible for two hedgehogs to get close to one another with all the spines. This is the only route. But Jesus didn't say, you prove to me that you're trustable. He said, I am giving you the gift of my trust. I'm giving you the gift of my vulnerability. I know that if I'm vulnerable, I'm going to get hurt, and that's the point of this whole thing. That's what this sacrifice is about. If I'm vulnerable, I'm going to get hurt. That's true. And I'm doing it for the sake of love. And anything else really is not Christian. The good part about this is there's something incredible about knowing this kind of love coming through us. There was joy for Jesus in knowing what it is to sacrifice. Some people have experienced this either with their own kids or with someone else's kids, knowing what it's like to, wow, I just give and give and give, but it's so amazing. There's something so good. There's such a knowledge of the Father's love as we say, I'm here just to sacrifice myself for you, to grow you up, to see God flourish in you. It's worth whatever I'm sacrificing. And parents that have given up careers or ideals or writing that book or going on that trip in order to sacrifice for their kids, there's a joy in it. This is the Father's joy. There's a joy in knowing Jesus' love as it's coming out of us. Wow, I'm vulnerable in the same way that he is. And there's a joy that as we are vulnerable, there is a closeness that's developed. I have relationships right now where frequently I'm a person will say right to my face, like, yeah, I don't know what your problem is. But there's a joy in coming back and saying, as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to keep on smiling at you. I'm going to keep on loving you. I'm going to keep on caring for you. It's amazing to extend myself in that vulnerability. So vulnerability in families. What does it look like? What does it look like to extend vulnerability into our families? Had friends one time, and it was really remarkable because they're like area directors for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship for the Los Angeles region, actually. And time when one of them was seen kind of down the hall, kneeling down in front of like their 3-year-old. And something had happened. I think the mom had kind of raised her voice or something. She knelt down in front of her 3-year-old and asked her 3-year-old for forgiveness. Can you please forgive mommy for raising her voice? This is vulnerability. A grown adult kneeling down in front of a little kid. Vulnerability in families. I've done this. I've tried to make it a point of doing this with my kids, and it's really amazing that you kind of think something happens with kids, and then they just kind of forget, and it moves on, and you think, I hope that doesn't come up in counseling later, and but it's been remarkable to me that it can be like hours, it could be like a day, and I go back to one of my kids and say, I'm really sorry for how I raised my voice or how I was too rough. And they start crying. There's like this release where it's like, wow, that was there this whole time. And how powerful when I'm vulnerable enough, and it's really vulnerable because I'm supposed to be the dad. But it's amazing, like, wow, this is a much more powerful thing than I would have thought. Like, wow, it was all bundled up in there until I took the time to be vulnerable enough to see it release. We know that in the marriage relationship, even the best, continuing to be vulnerable and to grow in vulnerability when things aren't going well, especially, is very difficult. It's very challenging. And we know that grace is never fair, right? It's never fair to go to the person and say, when you do that, it really hurt and I forgive you. But It's really the only way. And what a precious thing when there's kind of me against you and this frustration and this anger, and it's all justice. And I'll apologize when you apologize, and I'll trust you when you show that you're trustable. And then one person, the hero at that time, is the first one to just like kind of put their hand on the other person's back. Or say, I'm sorry for my part. Or, I brought you flowers. The one that's vulnerable, because the one who breaks the stalemate is the one who is the one that could be the most easily cut down, or the one that could be most easily attacked again. Well, you better be sorry. And that happens, right? But vulnerability in marriage is the only thing that will grow the marriage. Two people that you stay on your side and I'll stay on my side. I won't at all pretend that Susan and I have a perfect relationship and a perfect marriage. We have to work really hard. We're both like very strong leaders, and we have very strong opinions about the color of the paint and the position of the picture on the wall and everything else. And we have to work really hard at it. But any time either of us, when we're stalemated, takes one tiny step of vulnerability towards the other, it changes the whole dynamic. And makes it a really beautiful thing. This is true in intimacy in marriages also. It's not possible to have a good, intimate relationship if there isn't vulnerability there. Right? That's the starting point of that. What about vulnerability in the church family? It's the same kind of deal. And it works the same kind of way. There's relationships that get all stuck. This person did this and this person did this. It's very easy to just kind of go off and talk to someone else about it, or talk to a friend. And every once in a while I hear these little threads of, this person said this person about this. But how much more difficult to actually go and be vulnerable. But there's no other way. There's no other way for a relationship to be close without it being vulnerable. I just want to ask this today. What area, whether work or friend or sister or brother or husband or wife or children or church relationship, what area is God calling for vulnerability? What area is God looking for intimacy in a new way? What area is he holding it out and saying, I have something really good for you? And Jesus made a decision in the garden. Jesus said, I really don't want to love this way. I don't want it to have to happen this way. Because loving hurts and vulnerability hurts. But I have the same question for us today. If you're sitting in the garden and he's holding out to you, this is the place where I want to grow you. This is the place where there's an intimate relationship that needs to go forward. This is a person who needs you to extend yourself, because vulnerability and trust is extended. Then what are you going to